My great-grandfather was Fritz Müller. Now, I heard the story about him from my grandmother. She told me that her father, my great-grandfather, was a private in the Army in the Civil War, and that he had joined up as a substitute for another man who couldn't leave his business, and so he hired Fritz to serve in his stead. This was very common in the Civil War. Well, my grandmother told me that Fritz had been on the march to the sea with General Sherman. I thought that was quite interesting, except that at the age I was when I first heard it, I really didn't know who General Sherman was or what the March to the Sea was. But my grandmother told me that he also was a musician in the war. And that sounded much more interesting to me. Well, at the same time my grandmother was telling me the stories from her vantage point, her brother was telling his grandchildren, my second cousins, the same story about how Fritz was serving in the Civil War as a substitute and how he served on the March to the Sea as a scribe to General Sherman. And that actual notes written by Fritz were on display, and I heard both the Smithsonian Institute and the Library of Congress, so I'm not sure where these notes actually were, but I was told they were there. When my second cousins and I got together and compared our notes with what we'd learned about Fritz Müller, things just didn't seem quite right to me. But I tried to get Fritz's military records and his pension records, and it took me a long time. Okay, don't think this happens real easily. I had to figure out what state he served from, and that in itself took quite a bit of time. It took about 10 years before I finally tracked him down and got his documentation and discovered that he had been enlisted in the Army in September of 1861 and discharged in November of 1862, long before Sherman's March to the Sea. Now, the reason for his discharge, according to Fritz, was that he'd been in the hospital, and this was because of all the excessive marching they did in the Civil War, and that he had a little fall over a log and was injured. So he only saw a couple of months of action in the war itself and never served on the March to the Sea with Sherman. And when you think about it, would Sherman really have asked for a German immigrant to be his scribe on this famous march? I don't think so. I don't think my family meant any ill about passing on this story. Probably they heard the story from Fritz himself. The chances are nobody in the family knew the truth until now.